Gareth, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, it's fantastic to have you on. I understand you're a listener. Tell us about your book and how you came to write your book on Austrian economics.
Well, it's a long rambling story that starts off sort of being disenchanted in a bank for many years.
Okay.
And eventually
tell us about the bank, actually. That'd be interesting.
I think the only people who work at banks are disenchanted. There's any other category.
Well, I think some see clarity at some stage and some just want to kid themselves and stay there.
Well, money helps, doesn't it? That's the thing with banks. Yeah.
It doesn't. And that, to be honest, that was part of my disenchantment. To be fair, it's one of the nicer banks. It's a European bank. So, like the American banks can be quite cutthroat and nasty, and there's a couple of European banks that are like that. But this is one of the sort of the kinder European banks. So they were bright, intelligent, lovely people. But in the last few years, it just got to the point that there are a few strands to this. One was the the DEI, SDG, ESG stuff being pushed down from above, and it was all at once. It was very quick. And suddenly we were faced with doing programs that told us it was in our DNA to believe in all these things, that we had to be part of what we did every day. And it culminated with being sat in front of an HR guy. So this inadequate chap who was lecturing us on, what is a normal family. And there on the screen was two parents, a mother, a father, and two children. And we're supposed to go, oh, no, that's not a normal family. And all that sort of stuff was getting integrated a little bit. It's one of those apocryphal stories you hear where I sort of stuck my hand up and said, I'm not sure the bank should be getting involved in politics, but no one else said anything until in the loo afterwards, one of the senior guys came up to me and said, yeah, I totally agree, but didn't sort of have the stones to say it in a meeting. So that was getting to me. And then I was actually deeply involved in lending to all sorts of projects so it was project finance primarily, asset finance as well. And it got to be overwhelmingly renewables wherever we looked. And these projects made less and less sense. We were lending at ridiculously low rates. And my job was to sell this stuff. So it was almost like we'd lend to a project we didn't want to lend to because it made no money. And it was my job to then sell it to other people. And then the project would cost overrun and blow out and the rest of it. And it was this weird thing of seeing these guys, so really bright guys who'd been in the oil and gas industry, energy for absolute years, and they clearly understood the importance of energy for especially the countries where we were. Because I was in Hong Kong, so looking throughout Asia Pacific, and yet they just flipped from oil and gas, LNG, to renewables. And this was like the offshore wind, offshore Taiwan, and these things were falling through the floor of the ocean, but all this sort of stuff. And nobody seemed to question it. And I started to feel very isolated. This is before you then mentioned the fact that I'm a bit of a skeptic on most things. And I suppose the climate narrative is one of those. And that was just verboten. It was just a conversation you couldn't really have in the office. So there were those elements. And then there's the elements that I'm sure you'll be very well aware of, that the price of money has just crashed. So we were lending, the bank was making some loans at 0% interest, like LIBOR 0 plus margin 0. So it was all becoming a little bit disenchanting. Since the GFC, I'd already had a bee in my bonnet about fiat currencies. And to be honest, listening to you guys then set me off doing some proper research on it. And I kept sort of having these great arguments. I had some good arguments in the office as well as bad ones. About fiat currency and how this was the wrong way to go and how it's all going to change. But ultimately started to feel as if there was more to life than shoveling money out the door in this manner. And at the same time, there were not just your podcast, but many podcasts were coming out. And I had a bit of a chance to reevaluate what to do. And that was actually coming up to a bit of a crux in 2019, and then COVID hit. And everything seemed to crystallize. We were stuck in an island in Hong Kong for a year and 3 quarters without being able to see any family. So eventually we decided that was it. It was a good time to get out of banking for me, out of Hong Kong for us. My wife's Australian. I've got 2 young kids, so it was just the perfect time to move to Australia. And we got here in 2022. Stop me if I'm rambling, so having landed in Australia, it actually took, 27 months to get my permanent visa. And I needed that to be able to do the teaching course, which was what I wanted to do for the sort of second career. The idea being doing a career that I could enjoy into retirement rather than hanging on. So whilst I was waiting for that visa to come through, I've always wanted to write books. I've always really loved writing. I wrote one, which was a bit more of a family memoir about us leaving Hong Kong and then traveling through Spain and England before coming to Australia. And then I had this, as I said, bee in my bonnet about Austrian economics, what is money, listening to a lot of things, reading stuff, watching Mises Institute on YouTube. And I had a few months before I was going to get any chance to get my visa. So I thought I'd try and put it into a book, particularly for my kids. I wanted to leave something I tried to, first of all, get my thoughts on a piece of paper and get them straight. And secondly, leave something for the kids for whatever happens. And if I'm being really honest, a little bit of being able to tell you, I told you so, when it does all go horribly wrong.
Did you get a publisher first, or did you just write the book and then try and find a publisher afterwards?
It's self-published, which I think is probably quite obvious. I should have paid for an editor, but it's self-published, and you can do that now at an incredibly cheap cost. I think it was you can do it for £1,000, maybe 1,800 Aussie dollars.
And is it so? It's printed on demand, is it?
It is. So if you go on Amazon, you can only get one at a time, and it does take a bit of time to get to you.
But that seems quite environmentally friendly, in as much as these things matter. Rather than have a print run of, say 10,000, none of which gets sold. I was watching a documentary about Nietzsche the other day, and he had real difficulty selling, particularly his later stuff. So he had to self-publish as well. But the idea of having, say, a print run and then they're lying in a warehouse just seems a bit old-fashioned these days.
It doesn't. It makes you look at the traditional publishing industry and think, how on earth does that make sense anymore? I know. Well,
I'm not sure it ever did, except in the context of blockbusters. But if you never get the blockbuster, then you never make the big time to begin with.
Yeah, and I suppose also and if it's a well-established publisher, I suppose that is a sort of a third-party blessing as well on the book itself.
But you don't regret going the route you did.
I probably wanted to rush it out a bit more than I should have done. I would like to, because I think you can go online now and sort of allocate someone else to be your editor. There's I've forgotten what these websites are called, but you can go on these websites where you can ask for people to be not Viva. It was My Project or My. Oh, there's one that people are using in Australia, so you can literally outsource your HR function to an online platform, and you can do the same thing for editing a book. It won't come to me, I don't think.
Yeah, it's okay. It's yeah. So Austrian economics, how did you, was that an influence from Tim perhaps, or how did you find Austrian economics?
It probably was. The first time I'd heard the phrase was Austrian economics was coming from your podcast. Quite shortly thereafter, I remember the one with Rory Sutherland.
Yes.
And that was one which again really grabbed me, and I thought, the idea. I love that idea of being able to value actually can be created in someone's mind. And I bought his book Alchemy in the back of it and read that, and I think it's a really good example of what we're talking about when value is subjective and it comes from the individual. Sorry
to cut in, Gareth. Do you want to just give your definition of what Austria? Because it probably means different things to different people, and many people will not have heard of it before.
Sure. Well, I think it's. I saw your post recently on Substack, Tim, and I think you summarised it quite well. I mean, value is subjective, so ultimately all value comes from the individual, and on that basis, free trade is really the only way we can make proper consensual transactions and maximise value for each other.
So the only way prices can be trusted.
Yes, that's how price discovery has to happen for it to be to value maximise amongst individuals when they're doing consensual trade, and then once you sort of have that basis and you look at what is a non-consensual trade, you start thinking about government intervention, taxes, all that interference that we get that stops us being as having the human flourishing we otherwise could, which gets you down various different rabbit holes. The one that I particularly caught on to early was this question of what is money. And I find that a fascinating question. And the more you look into it, the more you realize there's not really an answer to it. And you end up philosophizing quite a lot about it being a communication tool of action and those sorts of things, which I find fascinating.
What I find remarkable is that, and it's not to sound pompous or pretentious, so it probably come across that way, is that there are so many people working in finance who probably haven't given this even a second thought. They sort of it's sort of something you grow up with, like, you turn on a tap and water comes out, but you don't question it. It's just accepted that money is this stuff that central banks and private banks create and blah 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 blah. But it's no one. Very few people ever go back to first principles.
It was definitely you, Tim, who was the first person I'd ever heard say we don't need central banks. And I thought I was pushing it a bit far. This is going back 6 years or whatever it was. But exactly that. No, people don't even think about it. And I went through an education of economics at university and then accounting with one of the big four, and no one even mentioned it. And if I hadn't had a bit of curiosity to run down those rabbit holes, I'd still be there pumping out fiat money and thinking, interest rates need to be adjusted accordingly, all this sort of stuff. So yeah, it's sort of a release from that world, but at the same time, it's a bit like the Matrix. It was a happier world than when you realise what maybe the reality is.
Not only do we not need central banks, we don't really need governments, would be the argument. If you look at history and how, from a recommendation from Tim, the book Sapiens, the Dutch economy, when the Dutch ruled the world, it was without government, which is quite an amazing thing to realise. And it was only when the reason why the Dutch don't rule the world now is because of government. When the government agencies came in, they started to disrupt the businesses that were doing so well, and that was it. And so it's a very interesting idea that the market will find a way. If you just leave the market alone, it will find its way. And central banks don't really do anything other than attenuate or amplify what's already there and then create problems further down the line. But with regard to the definition of money, how would you describe money?
I think I described it in a quite clumsy sentence, but something along the lines of a token that encapsulates the value of your time as perceived by someone else, that you can transport through time and space to be perceived as valuable by someone else in the future. It's very clunky, that one. I think a more simple way of saying it's a way of communicating action. Whereas we're talking now and vibrating air and giving ideas to each other and creating a conversation. And that's you get such a quite precise way of communicating, but it's not as honest as money, because money is based on when it's good money, and this is the whole bastardization of money. When it's bad money, it doesn't communicate well. But on good money, it's the best way of communicating who you really are, because it's based on your actions rather than your words.
Tim?
I'm just going to go back a bit in terms of to go back to the definition of Austrian, or as my colleague Killian insists on, often saying classical economics. I'm not sure there's necessarily too much clear water between them. The way I've defined it is basically, and this, I haven't done extensive reading, but I've done sort of the York Notes version of Mises and Hayek and stuff, and it's basically what I understand of particularly Mises' take on economics is that, or rather, what's desirable in society is sound money, small government, and libertarian principles. In other words, the rights of the individual have to be protected at all cost. And as I continue to bang the drum, the tragedy of our time is we don't have any of those things. We don't have sound money. We have overarching government, and increasingly since the alleged pandemic, we've had a complete crushing of individual liberties and a creeping sort of totalitarianism. But that would be my summary of what I understand as Austrian. The Austrian take on things, which is sound money, small government, and libertarianism.
That's exactly where I am. And libertarianism, I've been trying to avoid having any labels in terms of politics, but
because everything gets distorted these days, everyone gets polarized and starts throwing their toys out the pram at the drop of a hat.
Exactly. But the more I listen to people talk about libertarian beliefs, the more I think that's pretty much fundamentally where I am. And even what Paul just said, it sounds extreme, having no government. People go, what are you talking about? But actually, as he said, it works perfectly well.
You can see why governments and politicians are so scared of, just call it like, say, proper sensible classical economics, brackets, Austrian school economics, the extent that it makes people think there is no need for government. So it's often referred to as anarcho-capitalism, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's a little passage in my book where I talk about the word anarchy, which means no rules from the Greek root, but there are two definitions in the dictionary. One was chaotic lack of government, and the other was rules amongst people without government. And,
free market,
exactly. And then they're almost polar opposite, those two, but everyone understands the first and not so much the second.
So Tim,
have you come across? Sorry, Paul. Have you, just to quickly finish this thread? Have you come across a guy called Guido Hulsmann?
I just bought his book on the back of your podcast with Steve Wilkinson, so it's downstairs waiting for me. I'm just finishing Total State, which is his other recommendation. Because
I think ultimately, and unless you've studied the fully fledged, fully rounded history of economics, then these days you only come across the Austrian school by accident. Because I never read economics to begin with, so what little I know about the topic is sort of self-taught or self-discovered. But I had the amazing good fortune back in around the years around 2000 to be moving in circles with a company called Edelweiss Holdings and a gentleman called Tony Deeden and a gentleman called Sean Corrigan, all of whom are sort of Austrian school types. And through them, I got to meet and read Guido Hulsmann. And Tony Deeden himself gave me a gift copy of Jörg's book, which is called The Ethics of Money Production. And I was so intimidated by the title, it probably took me 5 years to pluck up the courage to read it. But once you read something like that, then again, it's quite an easy read. It's not at all dense or imposing. It's not difficult. But once you read something like that, it just opens your eyes to what, as the title said, that there is a moral aspect to money creation. And I think for probably most people in the city, after a while, they start to realize something's gone wrong and there's something rotten in Denmark, but they can't quite put a finger on it. But the Austrian school identifies exactly what's gone wrong and how to rectify it. Yeah,
I had the same sort of light coming through the clouds, the beam of sunshine with the Bitcoin standard.
Have you seen the light?
I think there was exactly. It was that moment in the church exactly. My trigger for that was the Bitcoin Standard by Seyfedina Moose. And it sounds like the whole book's about the Bitcoin Standard, but the first 3/4 is actually a really good disposition of what money is. And he goes through the whole question of time preference and how that can distort our incentives. And he makes quite bold claims that even architecture, thousands of years ago, people built things to last for as far in the future as possible, and now we build concrete things that crumble. And that, he was alleging, was a function of the time preference of money and how it's been distorted with fiat currency. And it just rang true. It feels like a massive claim, but I think it sounds similar to what maybe Hausman's saying in his book.
Sorry, Paul, I cut in on you.
No, that's okay. It was your definition of money that I think we were on the point of. So Gareth had given his definition, his take, and I wondered what yours was.
I suppose just savings deferred, maybe, or spending deferred.
Yeah.
So the reason why it's so important that we have sound money is because if you have unsound, unstable, inflationary money, it's I think, as I'm sure Mises would have said, it's a tax on everybody.
Yeah, Naval said something similar. It stores the value of your work or your human capital.
But the traditional definition is it's a unit of account, i.e. you can price things in it. It's a medium of exchange, i.e. something that avoids barter, the complexity of barter, and it's a store of value. And as as a value investor, as an unashamed value investor, for me, it's the store of value quality that's the most important, and that's the one the one that most conspicuously we don't have. So we accept the fact that you price stuff in dollars, pounds, or whatever, but people are, I think, slowly coming to, or maybe not so slowly coming to appreciate that the store of value quality has been a complete and total disaster during the period in which central banks have been tasked with trying to protect the store of value of money. So the whole thing is an unmitigated shambles.
And I'll go as far as to say it affects every corner of society. Like if you could earn dollar for dollar money as you're our age and know that it'll hold its value for when you retire, I think a lot of people would go for that storage and wouldn't have to pump it into financial assets, which is now we're so financialized. It's just, as we all know, an incredible bubble waiting to readjust. But like in Australia, we were mandated to pay, I think it's 12%, 12 to 13% into superannuation. So you've got these massive asset managers allocating money to where it wouldn't normally go, which then creates a fake price. So everyone's looking at their investment for retirement and can't rely on them properly. Whereas if you did have 100% store of purchasing power value, dollar for dollar, I think we'd all be much more relaxed and be able to think about proper investments that are genuine projects that add value. So for me, it almost distorts how we all run around like crazy every day, worrying that we won't have enough to live on when we're older.
I came across a great example of this yesterday. I was writing a commentary piece for a few weeks' time, and it was from the guys at Incrementum, which is a Liechtenstein-based asset manager that specializes in gold. And they pointed out that the iPhone 16, which has just been launched, is cheaper now in gold terms than the original iPhone. So you've got this amazing technology that's continually adding more and more features. And in gold terms, it's actually less expensive now than it was when it was launched. Obviously, in dollar terms, it's hugely more expensive, but that's because the dollar's worthless.
And and gold was a medium of exchange all over the world. You didn't have to worry about borders. There weren't really borders in those days, or not agreed borders. But now exchange rates are everything if you're managing wealth across borders. But Tim, I suppose on that front, it's not really a medium of exchange, though, is it? Because no one's going to accept it.
It's not a fair one. Well, I mean, this is something that the sort of precious metals market seems to be, the cryptocurrency and the precious metals market seems to be sort of working out in real time. Going back to the book, I mean, I don't know how long did it take to write?
Well, I actually I did the first 30,000 words, so 3/5 in about 10 days. It was a bit of a pent-up sort of splurge, and then the rest took another 2 or 3 months.
It was clearly a cathartic exercise.
It was that. It was like hammering away at a keyboard like a crazy pianist.
Which bits would you sort of dangle in front of listeners as the sort of potential the carrots, the potential highlights? Which things did you most enjoy writing about?
The one I most enjoyed writing, I think, was the environmental one, because I think I had to be as tight as possible on what I was saying, because I know how attacked that would be. The bit I want people to read probably more than that is the "What is money" section. Because I think no one thinks about this, and as you said, I lived amongst bankers for 27 years and accountants, and no one thought about it. It's just it's so glaringly missing from education.
It's a bit like a carpenter who doesn't know where wood comes from.
It is, and everyone's living in wooden houses, and it just seems like for that not to be part of the education system, such a glaringly obvious hole that it can only be.
But again, you can see why the government wants to keep everyone passive and stupid.
100%.
So, have you been attacked over what you've put in the book?
I haven't. I kind of want
not yet. The day is
not yet. It is young. Maybe this will be the vehicle for that. I actually want to be attacked. No, genuinely.
Really. Well, you want to argue, basically.
There's nothing wrong with healthy debate.
Yes. I do, because it's like going to the gym with your idea, and if it's not strong enough, then it needs to expire. Have I got this wrong? Am I going mad? I was having a conversation, and very rarely I'll bump into someone else who I can agree with on this, and we're both agreeing. And there's so few people who will talk about this. It's very hard to have a proper challenging debate about it without hearing the old trotted lines. The central bank's there to smooth the business cycle, all this sort of stuff. Trying to get people to that next level, I'm finding is almost impossible.
I think it might be a bit like value investing, to the extent that, as I think it was Buffett or Munger said, you either get it or you don't. It's like like an immunity to something. You either have it or you don't. But it's difficult to teach it.
So do you think we're stuck? Well, I think we are, aren't we? Until it all hits the wall.
So
because so much of this is about the sort of the learning process and the battle of ideas. I'm continually boring my colleagues with how much I like this podcast Founders by a guy called David Senra, and he basically reviews and extracts the highlights from books about mostly successful entrepreneurs or occasionally politicians. And I was listening to one this morning, which is sort of edited highlights of the history of invention. And one of them is the precursor to Lister. This is the guy that first noticed that, and I think it was in a maternity ward, that the death rate amongst mothers was sky high. And he then worked out that the reason for that was likely because the students who operated on these and gave help with the births had previously been dissecting corpses, and they hadn't even bothered washing their hands. So they came to their patients with like bits of dead flesh still attached to them. And he pointed this out and recommended that everybody wash their hands thoroughly. At which point the death rates collapsed, and the doctors at the hospital fired him. And it's the idea that you can have a revelation or an insight, and what's the phrase? No good deed ever goes unpunished. And then Joseph Lister in turn came across this and then introduced antiseptic, and the rest is history.
How did they justify? Sorry to cut into him, but how did they justify firing him?
Well, because he was rocking the boat, and I guess they probably felt their noses were put out of joint because he'd pointed out that they were inadvertently killing a lot of their patients. It's the more general point, which is, science advances one funeral at a time. Namely, if and they say this in business as well. If your ideas are any good, don't worry about people stealing them. You'll have to ram it down people's throats. People are just almost allergic to new, but ultimately what may be proven to be correct ideas.
I get the idea about, say, Copernicus saying that the Earth goes around the sun, and then what happened from to him. But in this case, there's direct evidence.
We'll burn you at the stake.
Yeah, but it
concentrates the mind.
It's indeed. But in this case, it was him saying, "Look, if you wash your hands, the death rates will go down." Death rates did go down, and they fired him just because he did something right. And obviously, we know that there's a lot of arrogant people out there who just don't want you to be right, and they will want you out because you threaten them and their ideas, and they can't take that because they've got such big egos and tiny minds. But
I think that brings us back full circle to the Austrian thing, which is the more people who get this stuff, the more of a threat it'll be to incumbent governments and business interests, particularly banking and financial interests.
Why did you feel you needed to write a book? Because there is plenty of material out there. What's your twist been on Austrian school economics, and what will people learn from your book that they couldn't from the Mises Institute, for example?
Yeah. So the twist for me was trying to simplify it, and I'm not sure I've achieved that particularly well, as much as possible. So I wanted this to be something that an intelligent 12 or 13-year-old could pick up and make sense of. And certainly, students doing economics age 16, 17, when I was at university, age 20, 21, and just get a different view. And the idea was to try and build it from what you know to be true as much as possible. And each step was supposed to be incremental. And of course, as soon as you build up on that first fundamental step, it gets a bit more uncertain. But starting off with the idea that time is our ultimate resource. Surely we can all agree on that.
Tell us the name of the book. Sorry, because that's obviously key to what you're just saying there.
Yeah, Our Precious Time. I was knocking around a few ideas, and it's basically saying that it is our absolute ultimate resource. But everyone's got time. None of us knows how much is left. All we know for sure is that it's depleting all the time. As we have a conversation, we're having seconds fewer time left of our lives. And how we spend our time is ultimately what our life is going to end up being, the actions that we do at that time. And then precious, you like this, Tim, is actually the root of precious is price.
Pretium in Latin.
You'd know that. So I like the idea of that. So precious and the price of time as well. So it's sort of combining value with time. That's where the idea came from.
Well, I love the idea that you've written a book, even though there is material out there. I would love if Tim would write a book on value investing, and Tim says, "Oh, but there's already books out there. I don't need to write one." But what I love about people writing books is they put their own stamp, their own ideas into it, even though they're perhaps building or standing on the shoulders of giants. It's still your own take, your unique take, and everybody sees things slightly differently, and you get a different from that perspective. You learn more. So it's great that you've done that. So for somebody who is thinking about this subject and wants to learn more about it, what would you say? Would it be simple enough for them just to buy your book?
The intention was for it to be absolute sort of a first step to being interested. So what I'm really trying to do is find that pieces of curiosity that loads of people have, I think, and just nudge at the door and get them to ask questions. And maybe they would end up having to Google Austrian economics. And it's not the easiest thing to research because there are the Mises and Hayek, and they're not always as easiest to read. I think you do have a lot of derivative versions of it now, like my book, but also plenty of podcasts and actually YouTube videos.
But they're hugely outnumbered by the Keynesian nonsense.
They are, but that's just like, it's reading fiction, isn't it, rather than fact.
Yeah.
But I do think, like, if because I think it rings true with people, or with some people, as you said earlier on, some people like value investing. It just that rings true. That's got to be right. And I think for those teenagers, maybe, or students who have that horrible, nasty feeling, going, "This isn't right. This Keynesian stuff doesn't make sense to me." It's just to nudge that door a little bit further open. What I might have done better actually was to have put a bibliography in the back that maybe has links to things like Hausman, or I find Seyfedin Emus very easy to read. There are so many books now which come out with Austrian economic ideas that are, I think, readable. So the idea would be just to try and maybe shine a light on the path to other areas where they can explore those ideas.
And
I think the timing is right for this stuff, because I remember anyone that sort of lived through and was involved in finance and financial markets in 2008, and there was this myth that, well, what was the expression that the Queen said, why did nobody see it coming? Well, the answer is plenty of people could see it coming, and they were all Austrian school thinkers.
Yep. And then they're still talking now, obviously, and then obviously similar warnings.
Yeah,
but that's what. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say it comes down to the corruption of economics, and that's something that one can see from lots of different perspectives. You can see corruption of economics because your discipline is the Austrian school of economics. You can see what's gone wrong. You can see corruption of economics if you become a trader and you realize that it just doesn't work in the way that it's written in the economics textbooks, and therefore your resultant profits will be non-existent and completely the opposite because the market doesn't work like that. Why doesn't it work like that? Because you've been given the incorrect model. Unless you tweak it, that's not to say there aren't people out there. I know what I would describe as market economists who understand economics and apply it to the markets, but it's not traditional. It's not something that you could learn at school, because that's all theoretical and wrong. And then you've got Mason Gaffney, who I know via Phil Anderson and Akhil Patel's work, who say that it's a corruption. It's actually a corruption via the schooling system that's purposely done to take land out of the equation in order to allow landholders, who are the most powerful people in the country, to hang on to big slabs of land and profit from it rather than sharing it with everybody, which would then allow there to be a situation where there's no tax at all on anything, and all businesses could flourish. So there's lots of different ways to come to the conclusion that the system doesn't work. But on top of that, the people who are running the central banks and senior economists who then get into senior positions within banks and advise banks, they all either willfully don't see it or just don't see what's going on, which is the frustration you see from the inside. And that was what I saw during the global financial crisis, where you have the situation where you literally see that things are burning, and you tell people and they just don't want to hear it, and they just don't want to know, because it's the measures of what they consider to be an alarm bell is not going off. You know, they're looking at US non-farm payrolls and saying, oh, there can't be anything wrong with the economy if non-farm payrolls are doing so well. And then you're looking at credit default swaps blowing out in Iceland. Oh, Iceland, well, that's not important. And then you also, looking at interest rates, short-term interest rates edging higher, and in a way that's really alarming and setting off more alarm bells, and they're still not looking at it because they're looking in the wrong place. They've effectively, got their back to it, and then what makes them want to look at it? They just don't want to see it. So that's how crises develop, and it's also why I guess it's so hard to convince people that they need to have some critical thinking when it comes to their approach to the markets, and to kind of throw away what they've been taught and try to work it out themselves.
But even that's extremely so. There's the fact that Keynesian economics tries to make mathematical predictions which arguably will never be accurate. But then there's been the whole sort of that the market always being completely rational really since the great GFC. We've always had this thing, good news is bad news and bad news is good news, because the Fed will do whatever it takes to rebalance, and it's a Fed-driven market. On that point, I'm so fascinated that you get people who've done PPP at Oxford. Is it really conceivable they haven't thought about what is money, fiat money versus a gold standard? That they're not interested in hearing arguments that might be relevant to their entire, what they're doing for a living and their brand reputation for history. I find it amazing. And obviously some central bankers, you've got like Lagarde, who's just a politician. So someone like Jerome Powell, is it really conceivable he doesn't think about these things? I just don't know. It's very hard from the outside to tell.
Well, it's interesting because we had Jonathan Escott, who was formerly a bond trader for some time on the pod a little while ago. And he used to deal with central bankers for his sins. And he said that in his opinion, these guys weren't evil. They were trying to do the best job they could, but they clearly have a slight sense of imagination failure.
Well, I worked with a guy who ended up being at the Bank of England. I'm not going to name him, but he wasn't. These are very nice, intelligent people who are just trying to do the best job.
Keynesian leaning, but well-meaning, perhaps.
Yeah, they're just trying to do the best job that they possibly can, but they're very, very, very academic. And the trouble with academia and being that smart, inverted commas, in a subject is that they go into the nth degree with their economic models, trying to predict things that just can't be predicted because of the nature of the or can be predicted, but not in the way that they expect. So Taleb explains it in his books very well. When you're using statistics to describe something that should not be described in using the models that they're using, and that's essentially the problem. If you look at short-term data, you can end up with an issue where, for example, one of the examples is if you look at short-term data of George W. Bush, you'll say that he'll never die because that's the situation. But of course, that's a nonsense, because if you can't extrapolate that out into the future forever, and that's part of the problem of the models that they're using. Something comes along and they say, "Oh, we didn't know that would happen. It was we didn't put it in our models." Well, if you think about it, you're going to look at a crash. Well, when was the last time the markets crashed? They crashed in 2001. They crashed in 1987. They crashed in 1929, and yet their models say that the chances, obviously the big one in 2007 as well, and yet their models don't take into account how regularly the markets crashed into 2019, into 2020. So, and if you look at their models going forward, and I guess this is the real crux of the matter. It's the arrogance with which they will not change their views. They will not look back at what they're doing and say, you know what, we got this wrong. Why have we got this wrong? What is wrong with our model? And that's why I guess we run into this frustration when we speak to people like that, where they're not willing to go back and say all their education was a waste of time and it doesn't work in the real world because they've got a very high-powered job and they're getting paid a lot of money and they're getting plenty of validation from, inverted commas, the system.
And we're in a position now where if they did say, sorry, guys, we did get that a bit wrong, and then you can look at the mountain of debt and what that means for a readjustment, I imagine it's a very hard confession to make. But on the whole question of modelling, I do find that sort of, as you say, so frustrating that academics put so much weight on them. Because we're talking about things that can't be modelled.
Exactly.
You know, there's a difference between complex system and complicated systems. Things happen that you won't foresee all the time, and as soon as one of those comes into your model, the whole thing's off, and then those errors compound. So I find it amazing that they just and you know they'll be wrong, and then the next one is expected to be right again. You've got a new prediction, similar with other modelling that we could talk about.
Socialism works; it's just never been tried properly yet.
Exactly. I mean, we had models doing looking at wind farms or LNG projects. And they were helpful in seeing what would happen if interest rates went up or there was a cost overrun, but they're not helpful if there's, you know, a piece of equipment falls off a pier. That doesn't, you can't really model that, and then that's a new paradigm altogether. And that's what happens in the real world.
Well, isn't it amazing also that when you look at these models, and not that I necessarily look at the Fed and the Bank of England's predictions, but they do have these kind of fans of how how inflation may go out into the future. So they've got this potential of error that extends out into the future as to what they expect. But at the same time, you then get the Fed saying that they're not going to raise interest rates, then yanking them up at an incredible clip, and then more recently saying, we're not going to drop interest rates. You know, damn the market, as was described very well by Danielle DiMartino Booth when she came on the podcast. I wasn't convinced that was what they were going to do, but she absolutely was, and she worked for the Fed, and she's a much bigger expert than I am. And then all of a sudden it's like 50 basis points off, and we're going to do another 50 basis points. It's like, how can they be so out on their pulse of what's going on in the markets, you know, and still not ask themselves the questions, what are we getting wrong? The answer, I think the answer is that they just don't need to be right. They just need to justify their position. As long as they've justified it, they think they've done their job, or I suppose they have. They're still going to get paid. They're still going to be in their jobs. They're not going to get kicked out of it. And that's how do we, it's like politicians. How do we hold a politician properly to account for completely fucking something up? You know, they can come into office, do all that damage, and then off they go into the circuit and just get paid millions to speak at dinner parties. You know, how do we reverse that situation?
Sort of error correction, feedback loops, all this sort of thing. Yeah, well, that's a function of the system we're in, isn't it? I mean, I don't know. I was looking from the other side of the world that was happening in the UK for the election, and if you looked at the big issues that everyone was like voting about, really would have been, I suppose, net zero, the war, what else? I suppose debt, the NHS, and there was no real difference. You don't get a chance to error correct. You can go for Keir Starmer, or you can go for would have been Rishi, but in the real substance, there wasn't that much difference between the two of them. You do need that disruptor, like maybe a reform party to come in, but so often we just see like the democratic process doesn't give you enough choice or say in changing things, that those errors don't feed back up to where they need to go.
I like the idea that, again, this is in one of Taleb's books, where he talked about how in communities, in the way that we've actually developed as human beings in communities, you would see the sort of leaders on the street. You could have a go at them, you could shout at them, you could hold them to account for the sorts of things that they were doing. But when a population gets to a certain size, there's that process becomes harder and harder. But then what I found quite interesting, I think this was written before Twitter had become the force that it has. When Twitter is, I guess, the market square where you can sort of sling mud at the people that you feel are doing a bad job. But the problem is, it's just become too much of that, where it just gets lost in the noise. And trying to make something like that stick, or it's not a proper way to have a conversation anyway, because you end up with an argument which is not nuanced in any way, because it's just text. It's not.
But I don't think there's a perfect solution to this, because the people that may be criticised will not have the debate otherwise. So the only way of getting the point across is to throw mud at them.
Yeah, I mean, look, it seems to be the only way to do it, but I don't think it's better than nothing. But what will be developed in the future to effectively bring this back to where it needs to be? So if a huge crisis can happen,
people are going to have to learn to have a sense of humour and get over themselves.
Well, there is that, but the other problem is that we've Gareth has just said it. It was Rishi Sunak, and now it's Keir Starmer, and then you can have a go at Keir Starmer all you like, and then it'll be somebody else, and it's always a moving target. It's always like, well, okay, but who's going to sort these problems out? And it's not that. There is no skin in the game, again, a Taleb phrase, for getting it wrong. I mean, you run a company. If things go wrong, you're held to account. It's simple as that. Why can't politics be run like that? Why can't the Bank of England be run like that? Why can't the Fed be run? Because there's no, as Gareth says, there's no feedback loop. Well,
it's not just that. There's also no need for the infrastructure of Parliament in a world where we could vote online about everything.
Well, isn't that
adopt the Swiss model?
Isn't that an amazing point? We've got this technology, this amazing, groundbreaking technology for the first time in history. Again, going back to Sapiens, when paper became a technology, it was an incredible change, and now we've got this blockchain technology, which is immutable, could be used for the purposes of voting. And yet, what's the one thing that it's not going to be used for is voting. Instead, it's going to be used to create money. And yes, you can understand certain arguments for why they would want to do that, because of counterfeit money and problems with that in terms of cash. But that's really not what people want, I don't think. And it's like, we know why they're not doing it. It's a control system. And if everybody could see without doubt who'd voted and how, and we'd have this ledger in every country, it would make perfect sense. But it just seems to be that's too simple.
A couple of points, if I may. And one is on the voting, being able to almost democratize voting to the individual for every decision. I just can you imagine the misinformation, malinformation? Can you imagine how much pressure there would be on certain parts of the media to guide people to doing, or scaring them into making certain choices on that? I find it frightening. And I think this gets back to almost where we started in terms of Austrian economics. It's the best voting system possible is good hard money, because with that your actions are literally reflecting the value that you're perceiving. All those different values accretions aggregate into market prices for various different services and goods, and that's how we get the best human flourishing out of people. This sounds very utopian as I'm saying it, and I suppose the best we could ask for is sort of some form of subsidiarity, where you go down to as small a local level of voting as possible, so that your taxes are distributed in your region, and the people paying or using your taxes, you know who they are, as you said earlier on. You identify them, they know who you are, and those community relationships form part of that contract.
The best model we seem to have at the moment is the Swiss model, where no one knows who the politicians are anyway, and that's how it should be.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't that. That was either the Greek or Roman way. I think it was the Roman ways of doing it. They just had placeholders. They just allocate people on a 4-year basis to basically be a caretaker of what was
term limits.
Yeah, term limits,
and no lobbying.
And the best way of being a good citizen was by not screwing up and just doing, what the Constitution said to do.
Mm. Well, maybe reform could do that. I mean, people have a go at reform, but I say don't let the best be the enemy of the good. But otherwise, we have to say just that we don't have a choice at all, because we have a uniparty in the same way that America has the uniparty.
And Australia,
no real choice.
We've got the same problem here. There are increasing independence, but there's atomized independence here, where you might get one, and the dream is that they have a kingmaker role, but it's there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the big two. But it's that question of, well, your vote won't get counted unless you go for one of the big two.
So if we could wave a magic wand and you're in charge of everything, well, what sort of policies would you implement?
I dread that question.
I think that the shrewd way of answering is I will abolish this post. I will abolish the post to which I've been appointed.
Yeah, all posts. I would go very gradually back to the gold standard. Who knows? This might be where we end up if the BRICS if what they're doing is what we think they're doing. I do think, I love Bitcoin to be the answer. I'm just not sure of it yet. It just feels it needs a bit more of a test drive to happen. But I think once you have a sound money in place, then the whole voting system, as I said, how you spend that money, if it's good hard money, reflects in society getting better, and actually the voting system should be that, rather than Conservative versus Labour Party in elections that we have nowadays. In terms of other policies, I just think anywhere where the government's intervening massively where otherwise things wouldn't happen, I think that's a good place to look. And I'm certainly quite skeptical about what we're doing on the renewable front, net zero. I think it's insanity, and actually I genuinely think quite evil. I think it's a luxury belief for people in the Western society to sit there pontificating about how we need to transition to unreliable energy, and it's going to push up costs for people in India and Bangladesh and cause a lot of unseen hardship. And it's just, are people not even thinking second order effects, or they just not want to think about it? And that's, again, it's one of the things I got a bit bitter about it at the bank, was people being cloaked in this green virtue while at the same time picking up bonuses and not letting themselves think about, what does this actually mean for people outside of the West? So yeah, that'd be another policy.
Because I love this sort of luxury communism of the Miliband brothers, where we spend £20 billion on carbon capture, or we could just plant a few trees and save £20 billion.
Yeah, well, I mean, the trees are planting themselves. If you look at the global greening, which I think even the IPCC has to admit is huge. But yeah, so it feels like we're being made to do things which go against the grain, which don't make sense,
and which political bodies have no mandate for whatsoever democratically. Yeah, they're being imposed without a vote. In the same way that Kamala is being imposed without anybody having voted for her. She's just installed.
And I think, people it does feel like it's starting to get to sort of breaking point.
Fever pitch.
Again, I don't know if this is, people I'm listening to or reading, but, you're hearing more and more about allopathic medicine causing problems, and, RFK is going to potentially be a louder voice in that. The food pyramid, no one really believes in that anymore. I think.
Well, the way I look at it is that, and I was very slow on the uptake. So for me, the global financial crisis of 2007-08 showed how corrupt the financial system was, and the banking system, and Wall Street and the city. And then what's happened subsequently is actually everything is corrupt. It's just that I could only see it in the context of the industry in which I worked. But it's big everything. It's big pharma. It's big ag. It's big food. It's big medicine. Is there a big anything that isn't hopelessly corrupt? The way that sort of Adam Smith warned us that people in the industry would tend to behave when left to their own devices.
And then the horrible truth is that if that is the case, which I think it is, and we need to correct it, the amount of hardship to clear out those malinvestments, those malpractices is going to be just so painful, and certainly too painful for a politician to get elected on. So it's one of those horrible ones where it almost has to crash against the wall to be resolved, and that's.
Creative destruction, I think, is the pertinent phrase here.
Yeah, and the way to do that is in small increments, bit by bit, rather than in one big smash, which is, I think, what extend and pretend has caused us to be in that situation.
What would you say to somebody who says, "Well, isn't that the problem with capitalism, and we need more,
More government.
More government. Exactly. Because that looks like, well, it's these greedy companies and it's the greedy capitalists who are doing this."
I have to agree with what you guys have said before, that it's crony capitalism. It's not remotely proper capitalism. I try and everyone's going to have a different definition of capitalism, and it gets very heated, and it becomes a political bugbear for everyone. But ultimately, capital is something of value that's been created over time. And that's best created by humans interacting in a consensual way. So I think it's a misframing of what capitalism is. The alternative of top-down control, we've had the biggest human disasters in history on the back of people trying to impose top-down prices and allocations of resources. It could not be a worse way to go. It's the problem of economic calculation cannot be made outside of the human mind, and therefore will inevitably fail. So that would be my response. I do worry, though, and I'd like to know what you guys think about this. It's like we're looking at algorithms and AI, and to what extent would AI be able to allocate resources perfectly? The answer from an Austrian point of view is still it cannot, because it cannot tell you what people are thinking, and what people are thinking is changing every single moment depending on context. But what worries me is if actually they're able to change people's economic calculation. We talked a bit earlier about Rory Sutherland and alchemy and how advertising actually does that. Is there a way, and Harari talks about this, isn't he, hacking people's brains, so that actually that economic calculation is taken away from the individual somehow? That's what really worries me. It feels like a bit of a out there fear.
Well, that sounds like marketing. I mean, that's basically the job of marketing, and you are being influenced. That's why what Rory does and says is so fascinating. I've always been fascinated by it, and that's why I really love Derren Brown's work, because he's effectively showing us how we are manipulated and how we can be manipulated. So that's one side of the equation. We can be manipulated, but I think it also goes to a point where people then realize that they are being manipulated, and that's a very human thing, that they then draw back away from something. So people get drawn into technology and they scroll and scroll and scroll, but then eventually they kind of get to the point where, you know what, I think I'm doing too much of this stuff, and they kind of pull away. And so I think that type of influence will only have a certain shelf life. Even though it is totally pervasive. You can't walk down the street without actually seeing an advert somewhere for, say, McDonald's or Coca-Cola or a big corporation. And their job is to always put that in your face, no matter what, no matter when, whatever big event, they're doing that all the time. So there's this element of marketing that always has to be there, and selling. But the AI question is, can it do it more efficiently? And it can do certain jobs more efficiently, but AI is simply an understanding of data that it has, and the use of that data to find patterns and look for patterns. And those patterns change, exactly as you were saying. So if we were using an AI model to track Gareth and what he was doing, we might find that in the last 3 or 4 years or 5 years, you were interested in subject X. Let's say we knew that you were a fan of the Foo Fighters, and so we would try and sell you Foo Fighters tickets and merch and all that sort of stuff. But all of a sudden, you suddenly don't like the Foo Fighters, and you, for whatever reason, you go to another band, and then there is a change. So you can never say, it's all about change and looking at the data. So that past data that says this then becomes irrelevant because you've kind of moved on. And so AI allows a vast amount of data to be studied, but it's still not intelligent in the way that people think that it is. It's just looking at patterns in its simplest form.
Agree, but let me run this past you, because I was sat in Hong Kong, and we had a lot of Hong Kong colleagues and mainland Chinese colleagues, and a lot of them are all on WeChat, which I'm sure you've heard of.
Yeah.
And WeChat's not just a payment system; it was also like their entire communication system.
Yeah.
So maybe a month after they last had a haircut, the AI would know they haven't had a haircut, and it would flash up, "Oh, have you thought about having a haircut?" And it wouldn't necessarily make them march straight to the hairdressers, but it would just see that, okay, time to go next hairdresser. So it could nudge them, and that's almost a dirty word nowadays, could nudge them into that direction. And then I came up with this fear that, okay, if you're only ever on WeChat, and let's say the communist government bought too many tomatoes, could they start giving you pizza adverts onto your WeChat, which would nudge you towards buying a big pizza with lots of tomato dressing on top of it? Could that sort of thing happen?
But
and I think
my point is that's already happening. It's just happening in a different way.
Yeah, but so I suppose the question is how tightly or specifically can that, if you like, advertising or nudging guide your economic valuation? And I don't. In the olden days, you'd see a big billboard and go, "Oh, that's nice. I'd like to be that person." But nowadays, do we know how much is us thinking, "Oh, I wouldn't mind doing that tomorrow," versus actually AI finding the right way to prompt us to do that? And I'm not saying it's there now, but I'm saying it's something I could see. If I was a raving communist, I could see this being a great new idea of holding both the supply and demand side of the equation.
I wonder if it comes down to what was said about if you get hypnotized, you can sort of do certain things, but you would never do something that actually, I don't know whether this is necessarily true, whether you would do something that you think was morally wrong. So I wonder whether the same thing applies. And I'm just sort of thinking aloud while I'm saying it. But I think the point is that we are all influenced by things that we're not even that we don't even realize that we're being influenced by already, just by virtue of existing in the world and then having this technology. There's an episode of Derren Brown's show that I would highly encourage you to watch because it's so clever. It's have you ever seen the episode? Do you ever watch any of his stuff?
I did. I've watched a couple. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So did you watch the one with the advertising executives?
No.
Okay.
Not that one.
No. So this was really brilliantly clever. He got two advertising executives, went to their offices and said, "I've got a job for you. I would like you to design a logo and a strapline for a new company, and it's going to be about what we do with our pets after they die." So that's the brief. Off you go. So they scribble away for, I don't know, a few hours. They come back and he goes, "How have you got on?" And they come out with these designs. And he says, "Oh, that's really interesting." So he shows the designs, and then Derren Brown reveals pretty much the same design that he's already shown. He goes, "Here you are. This is the design." And they're just like going, "Oh my God, how's that happened?" You need to watch the show to find out how he did it. But it was absolutely brilliant. One of them really accepted it. The other guy, there was two guys you could tell he was really pissed off with how he'd been manipulated. And that really stuck with me because it is, I used to think a long time ago that if you had a good product, you wouldn't need advertising. It would just work. And people would just say, "You know what, whatever it is, if you design the iPhone, I've got this new phone and it's absolutely brilliant." But I'm sitting here in front of the computer at the moment, and bam, iPhone 16 Pro is being advertised to me. It doesn't work like that. You have to keep spinning the flywheel of your mind by putting this stuff out again and again and again. And I see it in so many different areas. And another area that was absolutely fascinating, I thought, was that how the music industry changed from finding bands that were really good and investing money in them and with the potential of them failing, to deciding that they didn't want to spend the money doing that. Instead, that they were just going to pay songwriters to pick up artists who were fairly good, good artists, very good at what they're doing, but just have all the songs written for them. But they don't even necessarily have to be that good as a song. You just have to keep hearing it. The more you hear a song, the better you think that song is. There is a process that they understand. The more you hear something, the better.
Birdie dance. I refute your suggestion with the birdie dance and the Macarena.
Nelly the elephant for me.
But that's, yes. Well, I guess there's a limit. But you've got to be sort of into the music.
Yeah.
There was that song, the Shake It Like a Polaroid Picture. Apparently, I can't remember who did that song, but that's such a weird song that people didn't like it to start with. So they just kept playing it and playing it and playing it. And they worked out, then suddenly everybody liked it. But it's such a weird song. If you listen to that, it's not, it didn't fit any kind of song structure, but yet through the power of spending money, of playing it on the radio, you can get people to like that song. So I think the idea is AI may know that it could sell you a product, but the ultimate end is it's got to put that advertising in front of you. If it can't get to you, Gareth, if you switch off your phone and you switch off your TV, how else can they get to you? You have to use the technology. You've got to go in, I need Google Maps, and then it's got, we've got him, right, we need to throw an advert in there, somewhere. It's so we can sell this product. But if you withdraw from it, they can't do that.
Agreed. A couple of things I would say, though. On the Derren Brown one, there were two that I watched. One was about a guy who took a bullet, basically stood up to some bikers. So he was like stuff. I think they interviewed him. I'd never do that. I'm, a bit of a pushover. I don't really want to. And they end up making him do it. He takes a bullet for protecting. I can't remember who he was protecting, but it was outside of Boston in the West.
I remember.
And the other one was the push, which was where they made this guy or got him to push, or he thought he was pushing an old man off a building, and he did it. So to get back to, can they actually, can hypnotists make you do something you absolutely wouldn't do, something against your morals? It looks like, well, certainly there's one data point that maybe, yes, they could. On the question of, no, you have to be on the technology for it to affect you, I totally agree. And I think one of the big things about me going to Hong Kong is there was no terrestrial TV. I just stopped watching crappy news and started watching things that actually interested me. And my goodness,
self-curated media, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and it makes the world of difference. And I think I've looked back. But at the same time, they've just passed a digital ID law in Australia. Now they're calling it mandatory. They're calling it voluntary. But obviously, they're going to make it more and more difficult over time not to use it, or make it easier to use it, whichever around you want to look at it. So I think we are going to be pushed to a point where it's very, very difficult to manage your life without technology. And some people will embrace it. And, it doesn't have to be everyone. It just occurred to me that if everyone's on the same platform, or if all those platforms are talking to each other, that I worry that the level of manipulation that we have of our minds as to what we value might change. It's just a thought I had watching people in Hong Kong on WeChat constantly being bombarded and basically using that as their whole social sphere.
I like to think that the advertising marketing media is not quite as powerful as it thinks. There's a great anecdote about, I think it was two executives from Wrigley's Gum were on a flight, a commercial flight, and one of them said, we're spending so much on advertising, why don't we just we're a mature business, why don't we just give it a rest and stop the advertising? And his colleague said, well, we're at 15,000 feet, why don't we just turn the engines off?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, Tim, you could have been a copywriter, couldn't you? You considered it.
In an alternative universe, that could possibly be the case. But say because that was what I was intending to do after university, but I couldn't get a job in an agency, so I had to be a bond salesman instead. That's a weird chain of events that probably wouldn't happen often these days.
I very briefly, I left accounting and tried to do something a bit different with my life very briefly. And it was actually an advertising agency, Cordian. It was the other half of Saatchi & Saatchi, but it went bust pretty much as soon as I joined. So that didn't work out.
But yeah, the episode that you mentioned with Derren Brown, I do remember it. I think his earlier work was much more interesting, to be honest. And if you can go, obviously I'll put a link in the show notes if I can find. If it's on YouTube or somewhere like that, I'll put it there. But it was when he wasn't as well known, and I think some of the experiments that he did then were far more interesting. But again, yeah, I think the power of this is, and you know, you've got kids as well, and it's something we can all do, is when you see it happen, just point it out. Like that sort of takes it all the power of it away. You say, you see it and you point it out, and then you go, then it becomes a deliberate thing as opposed to a subconscious thing where you're just noticing it in the you know, in areas that you didn't expect to see it when you're just sort of relaxing. And there's another, the Century of the Self, by the way. Have you Adam Curtis, have you seen his documentaries about this?
No, it sounds good. I told to mention that.
Yeah, I did on the last pod briefly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's obviously, Tim, you know all about it, don't you?
Well, the only problem with Adam Curtis is once you've seen the spoof of it, you can't watch it in the same light again.
Yes, but you have seen his early documentaries.
Yeah, I've seen all the documentaries. They seem to be online only now. I don't think they've let him on TV much, but the last ones have been great.
It's absolutely fascinating. They discovered that in the 1920s or before then, that people weren't buying products on the basis of they were buying things on the basis of their utility value. So people would say, oh, I need a new pair of shoes. So they'd buy a new pair of shoes. And it wouldn't be anything to do with particular design. It was just functional.
It was functional.
Everything was functional. And they realized that American manufacturing could make enough stuff for everybody and would sort of run out of consumers because they had the capacity to make things that would last a long time, and people wouldn't have to buy them again. And so they had to create demand. So they
introduce planned obsolescence.
I was going to say exactly.
Yeah. And we know that with light bulbs as well, by the way. And so what they did was they contacted psychologists to work out what it is about people's desire to buy things, and they realized that if you associated it with a prominent, well-known figure, personality, sports person, actor, whatever, people would then start buying those products because they wanted to subconsciously be like that person, because they like that person and they think that that person's made a good choice. So that's where...
Which raises the question, why do they ever put Gary Lineker on Walker's Crisp?
Lots of other crisp packets have come out since then.
So, but it goes on, and it's they realised that women didn't smoke, so they had 50% of the market not smoking. So they actually got a relation of Sigmund Freud to work out what it was about women why weren't they smoking, to tap into their deepest, darkest parts of their brain to work out why they weren't smoking, why they could smoke. Or what would make them smoke. And they did a publicity stunt to effectively make women smoke by saying that, giving them the idea that cigarettes were torches of freedom, and that's what it was, giving them power, empowering them to smoke to hold these torches of freedom. And that's what then made people, because women didn't ever smoke. It was a male thing. And of course, the rest is history, as you say. So understand markets, financial markets, Tim said before, and I totally agree, if you were to go back in time and study something, psychology would be very high up on the list before economics, because it's all a psychological question about how people operate within the markets. And it comes down to everything. And I guess once you see it in effect, it kind of is like a magician's trick that you see how it's done, and it has no power.
I totally agree. I'd actually argue, though, that psychology is a fundamental part of Austrian economics. It comes from the inner self, and yes, that can be manipulated by others, but also, we try and become more aware of why we think what we think and what we value. And I think that changes as we grow older. But that ultimately, that's psychology and how much we're in control of that. But I would say that's because everyone, if you look at all the different definitions of economics, it's simply producing and consumption, allocation of resources. But it really is, like, for me, the ultimate social science, which is all about human action, which is driven by psychology. If you think that's fair.
Your book is called Our Precious Time. What other Austrian school publications would you recommend to listeners if they want to find out about and maybe dip in? Not dive in necessarily, but just dip in.
Anything by Rothbard. What has government done to our money is quite a nice short one. I'm going to forget.
Hayek. Anything by Hayek?
Hayek. I honestly. Now this sounds lazy, and I fully recognise that, but I am sort of quite keen to listen to other people's views of Hayek and Mises. So rather than go to the source, which I know is the intellectually correct thing to do, I have actually been listening or reading other people's interpretations of what they've said. I mentioned Seyfeddin Ammous before. He did the Bitcoin standard, the fiat standard, and he's just done the principles of economics. That last one was actually one of the things that inspired me to do this, because it was a very grown up. It was the principles of Austrian economics, but for people who had a lot of patience and time to read it properly and academically. And if you like, mine's trying to be a dumbed down version of that ultimately. But those ones that I would go for. The Anatomy of the State by Rothbard as well. I found that a brilliant read, and it's easy and it's short.
What has government done to our money is that title is, you could reverse it. What has money done to our government? And it'd make the point in the same way. You mentioned earlier that Bitcoin hadn't actually fulfilled enough trust for you at this point. What does it need to do? What needs to happen for you to then trust it? I'm not saying you should, but I'm just wondering, it's been around a while.
It has. I mean, to be honest, I listened a lot. I changed my mind on Bitcoin just before the pandemic, or just at the very beginning of the pandemic, and I did actually invest. And what struck me was an argument that said it was an asymmetrical bet, that if you buy into a company, it's always going to be limited, its value, by its potential future earnings, whereas Bitcoin arguably could be unlimited. And it maybe I wanted to be persuaded, but ultimately that's what led me to invest. I did see the one, and it was low at the time. I love the theory. Everything I've heard and read about it and watched about it on YouTube makes sense. It seems to be, the absolute fundamental basics of what an Austrian economist would say is a good sound money. I just worry that I don't know things like quantum computing, what impacts that might have. Ultimately, whatever government just says, no, you can't. You're not doing it. And then the third one is if the internet does go down, you just lost everything. So is it, as infallible as? And I know there's arguments that people get very technical about, how you could actually set up nodes without the internet and all this sort of stuff. But there are those sort of outstanding concerns for me. But you could apply that to any form of money, I suppose, especially the government banning it outright.
That's a very interesting argument. I've never heard that one before. But yes, you're absolutely right. thinking critically, there could be those other challenges. But what I find fascinating, actually, which speaks to your critical mindset, is that you're actually not really that convinced yet. You've invested in it.
Mm-hmm.
I think, what was it? The mark of an educated mind is to finish a quote that I can't finish. Tim, do you know that one? Is it Mark Twain?
You can both fart and chew gum at the same time.
In terms of practical steps, do all roads lead to either something like Bitcoin or gold when it comes to Austrian school economics? And that's obviously a question for both of you.
I think on an absolute basic form, I don't know what you'd say, Tim. Ultimately, it's you didn't need money when you had a few enough people that you could trust to deliver everything you needed in your life. It was ultimately a trust mechanism. You caught me a bit off step with that one. That's been my assumption. It needs to be either Bitcoin or gold. And then I know if you've read Layered Money, that talks about layers upon that. So if Bitcoin did perform the anchor to the real world, then it maybe lightning on top of that would be the medium of exchange layer. I need to think about that, Paul.
Tim?
What's the question, Paul?
I've forgotten it. No, do all roads lead to either Bitcoin or gold in terms of Austrian school economics?
Not necessarily. I think we heard recently that apparently Russia started buying silver as well, so it's not just gold. But no, I think I'm being semi-facetious, but I think in my head they do, because I don't ultimately discriminate between the two, so I'm perfectly willing to accept the idea of cryptocurrency, more particularly Bitcoin, as an alternative form of money. But I can speak with more authority on gold because I think I understand it better. It's served as money. I think Alistair MacLeod would say that gold is legally money in a way that currency isn't. Currency is basically debt. And in the words of J.P. Morgan, gold is money, everything else is credit. So I think gold's credentials do not need to be reiterated, though for many people I think they do. So it's a very, very strange situation, but.
For me, it's almost like at the moment, gold and Bitcoin are two methods of capturing energy that then can be transported. Someone made this point to me, and it sort of blew my mind a little bit, that the most efficient way of transporting electricity from New York to Sydney, say, would be to basically sell electricity for gold in New York, take the gold to Sydney, and then buy the gold in Sydney. And the idea there is that you've captured the energy with the value of gold. And similarly with Bitcoin, obviously it requires energy to create. So for me, the Austrian point would be that it needs to capture that proof of work, if you like, which is gold. It's digging it out of the ground and getting it to market. And for Bitcoin, it's similarly mining, but obviously mining in the digital space.
When Tim said that money is credit, I guess that's something that people don't really think that much about, because it was backed by gold and it's no longer backed by gold, and it's now in fiat terms a liability of the government or system that issues it. And I think that's the key factor about gold, given that it seems, I would humbly submit that I think we're living through the last weeks, months, years, however long it takes of an unbacked fiat system. I think it is going to completely collapse in our lifetimes. But the beauty of gold is that it's no one's liability. And that's the thing that so many people don't get about why it's so attractive. It's nobody's. It's a form of money that everyone accepts, but it's nobody's liability in the same way that fiat currency is. When we had the precursor to the euro, which is obviously going back a good few years now, over 20 years. What was were you in the markets at that point, Gareth? Were you experiencing the crises, the mini crises that led up to the formation of the euro?
I was accounting. I was auditing banks at the time, and was very aware of it, but wasn't deep in the weeds enough. I was a little whippersnapper in a big four accounting firm, just doing my job as told. So I remember the big debates about the euro, but I don't remember the mini crises leading up to it. Oh well, the ERM, I suppose you're talking about.
Yeah, well, you see, before what was happening with the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism, was they were trying to keep all the currencies within a certain band. And history, as we know, how the UK fell out of the ERM and then it boosted our economy. It was called Black Wednesday when it happened, September 92, and then it turned into White Wednesday because they realised it was actually a positive event, you know, something that anyone who understands markets would understand before that. But the point of the way the euro was put together was that there were these crises in currencies beforehand, and the markets were just going after governments and their currencies that they thought were too strong, and effectively punishing them. And it was an incredible time because the swings were absolutely massive, and you really got to see what the market could do if it wanted to push your currency around. And it was it was a laughable time in terms of what governments expected to be able to do. There was Nigel Lawson sitting in a bath thinking that he could borrow some money from
that's my week ruined. I won't be able to get that image out of my mind for a while.
Thinking that he could borrow money they were going to go to when they were trying to protect sterling, they went to the IMF and they said, we're going to borrow such a billion or two, or I can't even remember what it was, $1 billion to protect our currency. It's like, okay, foreign exchange turnover in 24 hours. At that time, global turnover was $1 trillion. So it was a drop in the bucket. And that's why the markets just went even harder for sterling. I think we're probably around $4 or $5 trillion, maybe more, of global trade. That's every 24 hours in foreign exchange. It's an absolutely massive market. And if it all starts to go one way, you are going to see something very, very special. But people forget that money in itself or currencies can be affected in this way. And we've obviously seen recently what's happened with the Japanese yen going in both directions. But that is the norm. We're coming back to the idea of crashes and crises are normal. It's just that people forget all about them. I'll never forget the currency traders are really funny people. They've got a great sense of humor. They're quick thinking. Guys and girls, but mainly guys, to be fair, at that time. And there was this joke going around that after the collapse of sterling out of the ERM, that the Spanish peseta, the Italian lira, and the Portuguese escudo were going to form their own currency union. Now, in currency trading, when you buy, you say, somebody gives you a price, and if you want to buy, you say that's mine, and if you want to sell, you say that's yours. So it got used as a phrase for everything. If you didn't like something, you go, yeah, that's mine, I'll take that. Or if you didn't like something, you go, no, that's yours. I wouldn't watch that, that's yours. Or definitely have that. So the joke was going around that these three countries were going to create their own currency, and they were going to call it yours. And that was because that currency was so bad. Those three currencies were just imploding. So it's insight into a time that people have forgotten, where these currencies, you can see absolutely massive collapses, but because it's kind of masked now partly by the euro, and it's masked by stability, like going through these periods of stability where it hasn't happened that sterling's dropped or risen by 20% in a very small space of time. But this is something that will come again, and it's so the store of value idea, I think, is a very interesting one that Taleb says that Bitcoin doesn't fit, but currencies at certain times don't fit that bill either. So it is a very difficult problem, but not thinking about that as potential long-term risk is also a mistake. And having an idea of, even if you're not going to buy, say, gold, thinking about currencies that could be stronger than yours is something that I think should also will always be in the back of my mind because of what I've seen in the markets. But in terms of what I'm trying to think about here is in terms of practical steps that people can take following what you've written and what you've learned, or taking another tact, what are you trying to teach your children that you think is really important for them to take on board for the future to help them to be successful?
I think that the first thing I want them to understand is make sure you value things for yourself carefully. I talk a little bit in the book about, because things are valued subjectively by you, to some extent you can decide what you value. So I talk about the idea of just deciding not to value a Ferrari and actually valuing the security and reliability of a Toyota. You've just saved yourself $200,000. Value the simple things in life, family, going for a walk, drink water, value water above, I don't know, Coke or an expensive alternative drink. So first of all, there's a bit of a life hack. Just learn to value things that you really like, that they don't have to be expensive. And I think the other main thing is that our lives, ultimately, we only have one of them. They're made up of our human actions. That's the story that you'll be writing with your life. So try and do the right thing, make those values, get those values correct, so that your actions have the most positive impact. Because ultimately, we're all going to pop our clogs. Someone will die physically, and then there'll be a moment in time when someone uses our name for the last time, and then there'll be the ripples we've left behind after that will really define who we were for the one chance we had on this planet. So just ignore the noise, value, get your values right, and follow them. That's it. Gets quite sort of philosophical and a bit. That's high horsey, but that's kind of the message I'm trying to give them.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic message, and I think that's I don't know how you would sort of top that. I'm not that I'm going to try and top it, but what sort of question to ask after that, other than I think we should kind of go to media picks, unless there was anything else that you wanted to say, or Tim, if there was anything else you wanted to add.
No, I'm happy for Gareth to go with what he feels he hasn't yet spoken about that he'd like to have covered.
No, I think we have covered most of it. It's I think at the moment I think the important thing for me is that I've got to a position where I don't regret leaving the financial system and trying to do something that I know can value into what would be a retirement age. So trying to find something to do in those later years, I also think is something I'm keen to do. But happy to go to media picks. Very happy to go to media picks.
Yeah, we live in a very different world, don't we? To when. I mean, I don't know what age you are, but I suspect you're younger than me. But I'm in my 50s, right? And if we look at what the kids can do today, they have this ultimate opportunity in front of them where they don't necessarily have to go to university. They don't necessarily have to work for somebody else. They can create their own business. They can leverage their own talents in a way that was completely impossible or very, very difficult. There was too many gatekeepers in the way. You can self-publish a book now and it could become hugely successful. And it does focus the mind on saying, you don't have to do this. You can do what you want to do, and you'll be far more fulfilled if you do that, which I think is a positive about the world that we have at the moment. But it's always like everything, it comes with this downside of getting caught into this social media system that unfortunately can be very destructive at the same time. But let's go to what you would have as your media picks.
So Paul, I just sort of rant a little bit on that. I completely agree. And I think we have these, as you say, the social media, but at the same time, we've got this amazing window into an absolute vast expanse of knowledge. And our kids, if they're curious, they could teach themselves on YouTube. The Mises Institute has amazing lectures, and there's all these lectures online. And one of the things I'm looking at, I'm 51. My kids are 12 and 10. So I'm looking very closely at what happens to universities over the next few years. Whether that piece of paper from Harvard is going to be worth anything, or will you have these more digital online universities like Peterson's Academy? That's something coming on, which will be almost internationally renowned. And he's going to be very careful that he doesn't let that be corrupted somehow, the certificate that he issues. But I think, as you say, there's massive opportunities. There's risks on all the online stuff and potentially gaming and all that sort of stuff. But the upsides are also massive. So I don't want to get down on the new world, because it could be an amazing opportunity for the kids.
Absolutely. So, Tim, what would be your media pick?
Well, that segues effortlessly into my media pick. So, of course, the main one for this week really has to be Gareth's book, which is Our Precious Time. But I'll let him promote that. The one I'm going to have for this week is actually from something that I saw advertised or alluded to in passing in a Tucker Carlson interview with Elon Musk last week, and it's called Hilsdale College. The address is online.hilsdale.edu. It's an online university. It's free. And I went up for my first course on Hilsdale College last week, and I completed their 6-episode series on Marxism, socialism, and communism.
Wow.
Which is a history of...
That's amazing.
Which is a history of each of those. And you'll be glad to know that both Mises and Hayek get a name check during the course of this. So there's an absolute reference to the Austrian school as well. But I thought it was done exceptionally well. They're like 6 half-hour videos, and there's a little test you can do after each of them. And then you go through all the tests and you get your little certificate. It's completely free. There are all kinds of other materials on there, but I started obviously with this one because it was promoted by the Tucker Carlson video that I saw. And it's exceptional, and it's probably the future of universities. And it's Hilsdale College.
That sounds addictive, Tim. Absolutely.
So, Gareth, you obviously, yeah.
If I may, I'll do 3 podcasts, if that's okay. The first is What is Money? It's a podcast by Robert Breedlove. He's a bit of a Bitcoin maximist, but he gets very philosophical as well. So some really deep thoughts about what is money, and he's had some great people on. It starts off with Michael Saylor, the first few episodes, but the one I'd recommend is probably the one with Lawrence Leppard.
Yeah, he's been on our pod.
Has he? I missed that one.
Yeah,
maybe that's how I heard of. Maybe that's how I heard of him from the beginning. Okay, but yeah, he's gone on to great. He's on hundreds now, but he goes very deep. And do you guys follow Gold, Goats and Guns by Tom Luongo?
Yep.
I do. Yeah.
How can you not follow that title?
Yeah, no, I enjoyed that a lot. I think he's got some very interesting theories about what's going on. I particularly liked his thoughts on LIBOR switching to SOFR for the US dollar, because I was in the middle of that and I didn't understand why it was switching, and he gives a very good reason.
Oh, and what is the reason?
So that the feedback loop between the US rates decisions doesn't feed back to them. Rather, like if the European banks wobble, as happened in 2008, obviously LIBOR rates went through the roof, and then that would feed back into all the funding that's in the US. Whereas once you made that break, that would no longer happen. So it allows the US to be less exposed or vulnerable to a problem with the euro.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the last one, just because I like to be a little bit controversial sometimes, I only listened to it yesterday. It's called the Dangerous Histories podcast. And the one I listened to was about a Dr. Katzenellenbogen, who was a eugenicist who drafted the sterilization laws under Woodrow Wilson and then became a Nazi, or worked in Buchenwald.
We've all been there.
And there's this amazing link between Woodrow Wilson and working in a concentration camp. Really interesting, and just some one of those fun corners of history to explore a little bit.
Absolutely brilliant. I think that's probably enough for everybody. I have a couple of things, but I'm going to save it because the thing, if you put too many on, it might be, people won't look at them. So I'm going to stick with those, and obviously the main one will be your book. So how would you like people to contact you? Should we put your Twitter handle, or would you like an email address or something like that?
Email address or Twitter handle would be great. But I'm happy to give out my email address.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you just tell me what it is, so when I go back to edit it, I can just pop it in the show notes?
Sure. It's a bit painful, but bear with me. It's Gareth, Gareth, dash, as in a minus sign, LON dot Williams at hotmail.co.uk. It's an antique.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. I'll add that and your Twitter handle. And thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for writing the book. And it's been an absolute pleasure, and hope to have you back. I'm sure we're going to, have you got any plans to write another one? Is there anything else in the pipeline?
I'm one's bubbling away, and it's all about sort of Australia and the mess the economy's in here, and how government program after government program stifling entrepreneurship. But I'm just a bit worried about doing that just yet. If I want to become an economics teacher in Australia, I'm just going to be a bit careful.
Are you doing Substack?
I am doing Substack. I'm quite active on Substack. Well, I enjoy it a lot, but yes.
Yeah, so do you want to share your Substack handle?
Yes, it's the Angry Gnome
as well.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll share that. I guess if you're thinking of writing a book, you could just compile everything that you put in your Substack, and it's also got a good timeline on it.
Yeah, no, I did use bits of it to put into the book to make it a bit quicker to write.
Brilliant stuff. Well, once again, thanks for coming on the show, and we look forward to having you back, and good luck with all your endeavours.
No, thank you very much for having me both. Much appreciated.
Tim, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Ta-ta.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Please do your own research or contact a professional advisor.